Hello and welcome to the 183rd episode of the Board Game Barrage podcast. I am Mark, the green tank, and with me as always are my co-hosts, Neil in the orange tank.
Hello.
And Kellen the red tank.
Hello.
How are you guys doing?
Good. It's hot.
Is it?
Hot.
Yeah.
Yes.
No. We have the miracle of air conditioning.
No, I mean, I was outside for a fair chunk of today, and it's hot.
That doesn't sound like you.
Today on the show, we are revisiting our classic series, Board Game Barrage, Designer of Games, otherwise known as BGB DOG. BGB DOG. I'm starting it up.
It's not going to
It's going to happen. It's going to happen. Everybody said that about Bob, and look at Bob. He's all over the place. Now comes the dog. On today's BGB DOG, we are covering the great Martin Wallace. Actually, in honor and in preparation of our review of Martin Wallace, we had a little Wallace-a-thon yesterday at Neelan's place. Played a bunch of Wallace games.
A review of Martin Wallace, like 3 out of 10. Kind of cute on weekends.
Well, wait till the end of the episode. We'll give our final ratings on a scale of 1 to 100.
Yeah, we have to start ranking them with all the previous dogs that have come to the house.
Right. We'll do a Bob dog. That'll be it. That'll be the culmination. But before we talk about Marty, I'm sure he probably hates that. Before we talk about Mr. Wallace, we'll talk about the games that we've been playing. Kellen's going to start us off with his play of the BGA implementation of the Diamond in the Rough that he found for us last year, Throne and Grail. I'll follow that up with my play of Dinogenics. And Neelan will round us out with his play of Lacerda's On Mars. Kellen, why don't you revisit the Diamond in the Rough Throne and Grail that you told us about?
You're wonderful emceeing, first of all.
Thank you.
But you did sort of reveal the best part of this section of the podcast for me, which is that Throne and Grail, a great Japanese two-player back-and-forth dueler, is now on Board Game Arena. And you can play it, and you should play it. And I've been playing it, and I'm very, very excited to tell people to go play it. Hey guys, future Kellen here, and I think a first for me to come in from the future. Usually it is Mark making us look dumb from the future. Throne and Grail is in alpha on Board Game Arena. What that means is it's not available yet to you unless you have played 50 different board games and over 750 individual games on Board Game Arena, which is not even a criteria I have passed yet. So yeah, hopefully you can find someone who is able to access the alpha games and try Throne and Grail, but hopefully this kicks into beta, and I'll be sure to update everyone when Throne and Grail is available to play on Board Game Arena widely. Thank you, and now back to me. So, Throne and Grail is in my top 50 games of all time, and it's currently my favorite back-and-forth light card game that you can play with 2 players. It also has a rumored reprint coming in 2021. I don't know when that's happening, what art they're going to be using, but what better way to go on BoardGameArena.com and try this out for free. Essentially, there are 2 different win conditions in the game, and those are get all the grails, get all the cups. If you get all 3, you win the game immediately, or whoever has the most points at the end of the game wins. Each round, you are only allowed to take cards once, but you're allowed to do it whenever you choose, which means that you might decide to take only 2 cards in this row, but you might wait until there's 3, 4, or 5 cards to up what you are getting. You are investing in suits of 5, 6, 7, 8, as well as point cards of -2, +3, -4. And so it's a really dynamic game where you can sort of shoot the moon by getting the grails, or you can just be more concerned with the hand management of what you're doing. The way that the suits work is really cool because there are 5 cards in the deck, and whoever has the most 5s will score 5 points. So if you both have 2 at the end of the game, neither of you will score points. And so there's a series of really tight, interesting decisions on every turn. I think I just heard the BGA sound saying, "It is my turn to take a turn in Throne and Grail right now. Hold, please." This is not a bit. And I have played That's how quick it is. That's how fun it is. Everyone should check out Throne and Grail. It
That's
has
how
really
fun it
delightful,
is?
cute art.
Yeah,
You really saw the fun on that.
Fun from here.
Turd, yeah. I was expecting like a woohoo when you click the button. You said, taking my turn, and that's it. You got to sell it, Kellen. Sell the excitement. Sell the sizzle.
Okay, Mark, if you recall, this game has a card in it that on one side says, you are the first, move quick.
Right.
And then on the other side of the card, it said, just a moment, you are the second move. Okay? So there's my trump
You should have
card.
started with that. That would have got me.
Exactly. I have, aside from our Wallace-a-thon, I have only been playing games on Board Game Arena. Mark and I have been playing a lot of Race for the Galaxy. On a previous episode a few weeks ago, he said, let's start it up, and so we started it up. I was very appreciative to win my first game of Race for the Galaxy with him, which I know he was not appreciative about.
Not at all.
And then I got walloped in the second game of Race for the Galaxy. Race for the Galaxy on BGA is both a blessing and a curse. I think one of the most dynamic things about it is trying to accurately predict what your opponent is going to do, what round they want to go into, and then trying to snipe them or benefit off of that. I feel like in a digital implementation, it's much harder to pay attention at any one point to what's going on everyone's tableau and, you know, how many cards they have in their hand, et cetera, et cetera. So there is less guessing and double guessing on what people might select. I think the two-player game is better for it, having you pick two actions to do each turn, but that also lessens, in my opinion, a little bit of that decision-making because a lot of the actions will get chosen in the two-player game. Still, I think Tom Lehman proves king of the tableau builder here. I think that this game has so much randomness in it, and yet it never feels unfair. Right down to the way that the game starts, where you're getting multiple worlds, but you're discarding them. You're getting a lot of cards, but you're discarding some of them. You start the game with a unique position. You are expanding and building out in different ways, and yet it always feels just right, and you feel like you win or you lose based on your own merits.
I could not agree more. It's that thing where, like you said, you start off asymmetrically, and then you are trying to sort of maximize the position that you're sort of in the lead in to start. And unlike other games where when you start asymmetrically or when you start on one path, if it goes wrong, you know you've lost. That could be the case with Race for the Galaxy, although I think there are opportunities to pivot. But in addition, the game is so quick that it's not like you're in there for another hour and a half slog. Like if you have a bad run of cards, or if you've played badly, or if your path is not coming to fruition, it's going to end and you can play another one, and it's just super quick. I've played this game now 50 times or more on BGA, and even though I've seen, I'm sure, every card in the base game and at least one or two of the expansions, I'm still excited each time by potential combos and ways I can feed off my opponent's action selection. I just think it's a fantastic game. Neelan, have you played this?
I have. I've played it a couple of times in person and a few times on BGA. I kind of found my games on BGA like a little bit lackluster, and I think that's kind of just no fault of the game itself, just playing a game asynchronously versus not. It's funny because like what I was hoping to discover by playing it again more on BGA was kind of not reaffirming, because I did not remember enjoying my in-person plays of it actually, but that was potentially being thrown into the deep end with a lot of expansions with people that were a lot more familiar with it than I was. But it did get me interested in wanting to play it again in person, which is something. Like playing just the base game and sort of coming into it fresh with like new eyes after a lot of time just made me feel like, yeah, there's something here that I do want to explore again in person.
I would say my ideal plays of Race for the Galaxy are two-player on BGA with some expansions thrown in. I think that's the way to play it.
And the last thing I wanted to mention is that I decided to play a game of the Lost Ruins of Arnak, not knowing any of the rules. Lost Ruins of Arnak is the latest deck builder, a popular way that people on our Discord play board games on BGA for the first time is by clunding it, which means that you just click on things until the game works, and you sort of figure out the game via osmosis through the full game, just clicking on stuff. And we are at 92% progress in the game, and I can tell you, I have no idea how to play Lost Ruins of Arnak. What I know is that when I click on everything, it says not enough tablet about 9 out of 10 times, and then the other 1 out of 10 times, it says not enough idle. And then I have to clear all the boxes so that I can click pass, which seems to be the only thing that I can do. I can buy cards. That's been interesting. I've gotten some of those. And then my hands seem to be predominantly fear-based, which I don't know how I got those. There is a track on the right-hand side that I have made progress. I've moved up 2 spaces on this track at 90% through the game, so I assume that that's really good.
Yeah.
And by function of all the scoring happening at the end of the game, I can only assume that I have won my first game of the Lost Ruins of Arnak, and I will be eager to report on how I did when this concludes.
It's that strategy of getting only fear cards into your hand. That's my high-level play there.
And no tablet. Never get a tablet.
No tablet.
Absolutely.
The HF&T strategy.
As it's called, yeah.
Yeah, high fear, no tablet. You've been reading the strategy guides again.
Yes, I apologize to all 3 of the other players who agreed to play this with me. They did know I was clunding it. They did know, just to be fair.
That's good. I was actually very worried about that. I felt bad for those folks.
You're like, geez, randoms on BGA are playing with Kellen from Board Game Barrage, and he's like at negative points.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair. That is my adventures on Board Game Arena over the past week.
I had a chance to play Dinogenics by Ninth Haven Games. Dinogenics, and don't get it confused with Dinosaur Island, which are 2 games based on creating dinosaurs on an island. Dinogenics is a worker placement set collection sort of game. First thing to note about Dinogenics is the most obvious thing when you open up the box. It is full of pieces. It is chock full of pieces, which is actually, speaking of ways that it was similar to Dinosaur Island, another game that is chock full of pieces. And the pieces are, as you might imagine, a whole bunch of different types of dinosaurs. I think it actually surpasses Dinosaur Island in this respect, because I think there are 9 varieties of dinosaurs in Dinogenics, and they all are represented by fantastic meeples. And the player boards are recessed boards. The cards are really nice cards. There are fences that you're putting on your island that are 3D fences that you're placing to encircle the dinosaurs. It's just, the production is off the charts. Fantastic. Great production. That said, I was sort of apprehensive playing it, or maybe apprehensive is too strong a word, but I'd owned and played Dinosaur Island and thought it was okay. Nothing fantastic. And so with so many similarities between the 2 games, I was sort of concerned that I was going to have the same reaction to Dinogenics. The way you play Dinogenics, as I mentioned, is a worker placement game. The crux of it is there are just a few spots on the board. It's a game where when you open up the box, you have all these pieces and it feels like it might be daunting. But really, there's only a handful of worker placement spots on the board, and they really come down to just a couple things. Some are getting cash, some are adding visitors to your island, some are buying buildings for your island, but the vast majority of the spots on the board involve acquiring these DNA cards. This is where the set collection comes in. The different types of dinosaurs require a different number of cards, and if you can acquire that many cards, you can go to another space to create the dinosaur. So, for example, the Stegosaurus cards might have a number 2 on it, and that means you have to acquire 2 Stegosaurus cards from one way or another, go to the create a dinosaur spot on the board, and then you trade those 2 Stegosaurus cards for a Stegosaurus meeple that you place on your island. Tyrannosaurus would take 5 cards. So there are different levels of dinosaurs, take different number of cards, and give your theme park more fame, more income for having the more attractive / volatile dinosaurs, because that's the other part of the game. You're getting these dinosaurs on your board, and you have to make sure to feed them and pen them in properly. So Tyrannosaurus might need a cage that is a 3 square cage, whereas the smaller dinosaurs may need a smaller one. Tyrannosaurus needs 2 meat per round, whereas all other carnivores need 1, and the herbivores obviously don't need any. So there is a push your luck aspect in this part of the game where you can house the dinosaurs in a way that is not what they require, but then they might rampage and destroy your stuff and eat your visitors, which is bad. And that's basically how the game works. There's also an event deck, which is handled well. I usually don't like event decks because they add some randomness that I find generally distasteful, but this is a situation where the event deck will show what's coming up in the next round so you can sort of plan ahead. All in all, I think it is definitely a superior game to Dinosaur Island. I think if you have a person who in your life is a board game fan and is a fan of Jurassic Park, the game to get is Dinogenics. That said, while I enjoyed it more than Dinosaur Island and I would be happy to play it again, especially with somebody who's enthusiastic about the theme, because I can see that being a hit, because, again, the production is fantastic. It is, for all the stuff that you get with it, for all this, all the wood and all this stuff, it is a fairly standard, simple sort of worker placement set collection game. It's handled well, it's done well, but not super remarkable. I found the press your luck thing to be pretty much a non-starter. Like in the games that I've played, the players who, when they get a Tyrannosaurus, they put him in a pen that works for them. They plan ahead and they put him in the pen that works. There's not a lot of push your luck because it doesn't seem like it's worth it. The risk reward doesn't seem to make sense. But even with that failing, and even with it being sort of like a not knock your socks off design, it is a solid game. And again, I can wholeheartedly recommend this for the gamer who wants a Jurassic Park board game. It's handled well.
I think one of the things that stood out for me from like what you were saying there, Mark, is if you have a gamer that likes Jurassic Park, if you're a fan of the theme, etc. Like, I know obviously like when you're talking about penning dinosaurs and like the risk reward of that, like there is a tie to the theme there. But without that theme, does the game work? Does the game have anything of interest? I mean, and that's a bit reductive because I'm not trying to like say...
That's a great question. That's a great question because I kind of sort of believe that most themes can be replaced. I think in general, when it comes to Euro games, most themes, like, you know, there may be ways that you have to shoehorn things in, but most themes can replace. I can see this being a, I don't know, cooking theme where you're trying to gather the ingredients and
sure,
turn them into a dish or something like that. I think it works regardless of the theme. I think it's a solid game. I think it's a solidly designed game, but it's not on its own, on the mechanisms, on the design. I don't think it's like, I would not recommend this game just based on the mechanisms alone because they're not that remarkable. It's solid. I think, you know, it's not bad. Like on mechanisms alone, I would say this is a 6. Totally fine. But with production, maybe a 7 or something. And then for a fan of the theme, then an 8, 9 sort of thing.
And it's got to be a popular theme, right? Given how many dinosaur games have hit in the last couple of years.
Sure. And of the ones I've played, not that I've played a ton, I think this is probably among the best. It was an enjoyable experience for as shallow as it is to be like deriving your enjoyment from the little pieces. Sure. It's fun. Like at the end of the game, you know, you've got all these fences and all these dinosaurs and, you know, turning in the DNA cards for dinosaurs. There's fun to that. You know, the meat you feed them are not little meat meeples. They're goats. So you go to the farm to get goats and you feed the dinosaurs a goat. So, and even the goat meeples are great. So it's well produced, solidly built, maybe unremarkable on the design front, but still, I would recommend it for that audience.
Mark, can you confirm, based on photographs I'm seeing, that you can play animal upon animal with your Dinogenics pieces?
You absolutely can. You absolutely can. There are both the interestingly shaped pieces and the quantity of pieces necessary to play animal upon animal with this game.
Take my money.
There you go. And that is Dinogenics by Ninth Haven Games.
Though there has only been one good Jurassic Park film, and that is, of course, Jurassic World.
How dare you?
Jurassic Park, the original, was a revelation when I watched it in the theater. You may not have been born yet, but...
Michael Crichton only liked Jurassic World. You can quote me on that.
Okay. Neelan, why don't you tell us about On Mars?
On Mars is the latest big box game by Eagle Griffin and Vitalis Serda. This was a successful Kickstarter that fulfilled some time ago. I played it at some point very close to it, sort of first hitting a Kickstarter. I played it on a tabletop simulator, and I was interested to return to it on the basis of having another Kickstarter right now. There is the Alien Invasion expansion, which I believe is a cooperative expansion coming for On Mars. So I sort of had this bout of curiosity if this is a game that I should consider picking up in the second run. So I returned to On Mars with a friend of the podcast, Frank, who was kind enough to teach to me and play it with me. The premise of On Mars is that you are building a colony on Mars. You are effectively doing this with other players. You're sort of, you know, I'm not going to say collaboratively because it is a competitive game, but the basis of the idea is that you are moving between the surface of Mars and a space station in orbit, picking up resources, building the colony, repeat. The colony wants specific types of buildings, and you'll get rewarded for building those. And you keep doing this until certain conditions have been met, which ends the game, and you collect a whole bunch of victory points from a bunch of different places. The core mechanic I described of moving between Mars and the space station is kind of the crux of what makes this game really, really interesting to me, at least conceptually, because it is effectively a quite complex worker placement game where all of the worker placement spots are divided between the space station and Mars. And you can only do the actions by being in that location. So let's say you're on the space station, you're going to take a bunch of worker placement actions, and those are going to be typically about researching new technology, getting resources, and then at the end of every round, the shuttle moves closer to traveling to the other destination. So if the round ends at an opportune time for you, you can travel to the other location, which if you time that right, you now have everything you need to move down to Mars, start building the base. And the idea is you're moving back and forth at the correct times in order to do that efficiently. The biggest thing I have to say out right off the bat is this is an incredibly complex game. If you have any stock in BGG's weight metric, this is the heaviest board game I've ever played. In fact, I was actually kind of surprised to discover that it was one of the heaviest, if not the heaviest, popular board game of the last 10 years, which is kind of crazy. Like, even comparing it to stuff like Arkwright, which I know is famously heavy, like, it edges it out. Anyway, there's a lot going on in On Mars. So much that I definitely can't explain all of its systems in the context of this episode. But some of the important things you're doing and some of the cooler systems about this revolve around building buildings on Mars. Because at every point in the game, the colony requires specific types of buildings. There are 4 different types tied to different resources. And if you build the type that the colony requires, you're going to get rewarded in victory points for it. Whereas if you build a type that it doesn't require, you won't. So this idea that if you are good at building one type of building, you can just repeatedly build that over and over, it doesn't exist. You sort of have to be able to diversify. You have to be able to adapt to what the colony needs. And if someone beats you to the punch on building a specific building, you either are out of luck or have to find a way to pivot, which can be very, very tense. But like all Lacerda games, there is such a level of complexity to all of the actions in this that I kind of found pretty exhausting. These steps towards building a building, for example, are like having your builder robot be in the correct location, then making sure that the hex you place is exactly 1 hex away from one of the same type. Or if you want to make it a compound, then it's connected to the buildings, but then your tech has to be a certain level, or someone else can have that tech and then you can borrow it. You know, it's just step upon step upon step on rules in order just to place a hex onto the board and say you built the building. And that's kind of across the board. Even the worker placement structure, the basic core of the game, is complicated. Some spots require workers, some don't. Some can be boosted by workers, some can't. Some exhaust. It's just a lot. And I think that the overall problem I had with this in totality was kind of that I didn't find anything that I was doing especially rewarding. So, like, this would have been a great fit for our episode a few weeks ago when we spoke about rules investment. And this is a prime candidate of an example of a game for me that did not reward the rules investment. There is something to having those turns where, you know, you've pieced everything together and everything interconnects with everything else. So you've built this chain of actions that leads to this moment and you have this big turn and everything pays off in a way that feels great. But then you look at what you've done, and that was in service of placing a hex on the board. Callan sometimes talks about like games as a Sudoku puzzle, which I don't want to use as a pejorative because I love Sudoku. But like, what's funny is like it reminds me of like you have the moment of like, oh my god, if it's this, then the 3 goes here, that goes there. It's a 9, and then you draw a 9, and that's it. And that's the sum total of like 5 minutes of mental exercise, and that's what this feels like. I just don't look back on anything I've done and feel like, wow, that was a cool thing I did there. And even at the end of the game, where you're, you know, ostensibly building this colony with other players around the table, it's just a grid of like colored hexes. It doesn't have structure to it. It doesn't even look as cool as a game of terraforming Mars does, where you look at the way the planet has blossomed over the course of it. It just doesn't amount to anything I thought was mechanically or thematically interesting. I think, again, the core premise, moving back and forth between these locations, is very, very cool, and there could have been a really, really interesting game built around that feature alone, but there's so much other stuff bolted onto this that I just found it really, really, really frustrating.
How does this stack up to Escape Plan and to other Lacerda games maybe you've played?
I will say that I was more interested in playing further games of Escape Plan, but
they both sort of net
they
out
would
the
probably
same
be
place,
similar, I would say, in my estimation, in terms of like how excited I was to be like, man, this was a cool manifestation of mechanics in the theme, right? And I definitely don't want to turn this into like an anti-Lacerda rant, because I've mentioned previously I'm a huge fan of Vinhos Deluxe. An excellent game. That seems to me like the game of his that I've played where the theme feels so integrated into what you're doing, and it leads to these natural high points where you take your wine to a contest and just there's like this feeling that with a theme like integrates with what you're doing, it feels rewarding.
You didn't say that last week during the draft episode.
I was trying not to like press people into voting for you, obviously. That's like bottled it down. But yeah, it's tough because I do think that there are times where he can get those systems working together with a theme and it feels rewarding. And I didn't get that with this. And this should be a theme that shouts out at me. You know, it's building Mars. I love space. I love sci-fi themes. The production is beautiful. Ian O'Toole, this guy, you should be watching out for this guy's art. This guy is...
I've heard about him. I've been coming.
This guy's going places. Ian O'Toole, let me tell you. No, but it's another fantastic Ian O'Toole, like, Eagle Griffin production. It looks beautiful aesthetically, but again, like, you don't look back on what you've done at the end of it and feel like you built anything or accomplished anything. It was all a little bit of like, what was this all in the service of?
But Neelan, how will people know how smart I am?
Sudoku. It's also hard because I also don't want this to feel like overtly negative. I thought it was fine. I would probably play it again if pushed. I just wasn't at all excited by it. That is, unfortunately, and this is, again, like, I'm always so interested in returning to his games, and I still feel like, based on what you said, Mark, I owe Kanban a try at some point. But this one was a bit of a miss for me. That was On Mars by Eagle Griffin Games and Vital Lacerda.
A quick note before we move on to the main topic. There is one more week left to vote on which tank you thought had the best result of last week's draft episode. So if you're not aware, last week we did another draft, this time of the Board Game Geek 101 to 200th ranked games, where we each picked 5 in a draft order. And if you want to, you can go to boardgamebarrage.com/draft and vote on your favorite. And there's still time to win a $50 gift certificate to the online board game retailer of your choice. So go and vote. And now on to our feature topic, Martin Wallace. So, as we mentioned, we had a Martin Wallace game day yesterday where we played a couple of his games. We'll get to them when we get to them. But let me give you guys a little background on Mr. Wallace. So sit back and relax as I take you through the life of Martin Wallace. No. So Martin Wallace is an English designer. He was born outside of Manchester. I think he lives in New Zealand now, but he's English by birth. Got his sort of formative board gaming chops by working at a Games Workshop store. I know Neelan has some history with Game Workshop games, although not much of a Warhammer guy anymore. But
still a Warhammer fan, but like I don't play it anymore. Like the license at large, absolutely. But yeah, I mean, that's
never
cool.
Take the Warhammer out of him.
Yeah, you can take the boy out of the Warhammer, but you can't take the Warhammer out of the boy.
I will say this like entirely like anecdotally. Every single time I've been into a Games Workshop store proper, especially the ones in the UK, all of their staff are so enthusiastic and so into what they're doing that I love this revelation that Martin Wallace used to work there, because it just seems it makes him all the more exciting and interesting to me. And I'm sure he would be a lovely person in person.
He worked at the second ever
Wow.
Games Workshop store. So yeah, we'll get into more of this later because I think it informs a lot of his game designs. He has a degree in history, and so that will inform his game designs as we discuss them. So before we do a more individual dive into some of his more well-known or influential or critically acclaimed games, what is your feeling or impression or thoughts on Martin Wallace as a designer in general?
I think it's clear one of my personal failings as a board gamer is less experience with the train genre of games in general. So, a couple of the games that I have played of Mr. Martin Wallace are train games. So sometimes it's hard for me to place him in and around the train genre because I don't have that big exposure or experience. I think the first Martin Wallace game I ever played was Age of Steam a very long time ago in a bar in New York City. And I just remember being overwhelmed by everything that was going on. I think what I like about Martin Wallace is that he is not a Eurogame designer. And that might be self-evident or not that interesting to say, but I think that a lot of modern board gaming is typified by, these are war games, these are 18xx games, and these are, your Ameritrash games and Dudes on a Map games. And Martin Wallace sort of has this ability to not be a Eurogame designer who is mixing and blending some things that feel very thematic, mixing and blending train games, and mixing and matching economic games in a way that feels right at home for Eurogame players to experience maybe mechanisms that they have not played before. I think Martin Wallace is on the short list of designers that I would always probably say yes to trying each game once, but my play of his games is as hit or miss, and it misses as often as it hits for me, but that does not stop me from being excited when I see his name on the cover of a board game.
Yeah, I think that gets to the heart of kind of like what I've always appreciated that I wanted to try a Mon Wallace game, is that you never quite know what you're going to get, is kind of always been my take. And like, you know, there is like certainly a through line. Like the games that we played on our Wallace-a-thon were all on some level new to me. And it is interesting, like as I get more and more exposed to his designography, thank you, Mark. That's the word I was looking for, is like seeing the through line through those games, like the reliance on like hand management and simple action systems and like this economic system on a lot of them. I was interested to see like something in Brass, which I did not realize, again, by not having a lot of familiarity with 18xx and train games at large, the idea of shared infrastructure. You know, like I had played Brass Birmingham, but it wasn't until I played one of the other trade games that we played, Railways of the World, that I sort of started to see like the connective idea of like, oh, it's an economic game, but you're not going to be able to exist on your own. There is a network that you have to connect into. Like just seeing like those through lines for him was interesting, because like while there is some iteration, like what Mark was saying, on those ideas, they still feel very disparate. Like he's doing something very different and interesting with each of those games, despite having like some shared ideas and some shared mechanics.
And I think his background actually lends itself to what both of you guys were talking about, because he is a designer who has said time after time that he designs from theme first. He doesn't think of a mechanism and then build a game around it. And that also would go with his history background, because, you know, he's not a math guy, at least by college formal training. He's a historian. So he is interested in what is this game going to be about, and then let me design a game around it. Another aspect of his background that sort of like melds with this is that he was a guy who played, in addition to the Warhammer games and the Games Workshop games, he comes from a very old hex and counter wargaming background. He played a lot of those old style war games. And I've heard him talk about how playing those very first Euro games was a revelation to him. He came from this old fashioned long game, complicated rule set. And then he played Euro games, those first Euro games, and was blown away by how interesting the choices could be, but in a much simpler form and a much quicker time frame. So he's a sort of a person who works theme first and is getting his design ideas from like this myriad of weird different places.
Yeah, I think during Wallace-a-thon, I had the opportunity to play Brass for the first time. And so this is a huge one, and I think it's the right time to touch on it, given what we were talking about with markets. And what I was most impressed by in my first play of Brass Lancashire is how simplified the markets were. The synergies between all of the different markets and how they interact with one another, and the players on the board, and the shared incentives of, if I make coal, then Mark and Neelan are more incentivized to do X, was a fascinating thing to unpack. And it was so simple to get to it. Like nothing short of, for me, you know, one of my favorite games ever is Archipelago, and sort of that marketplace mechanism that this has. This felt like as simple as that, but even more complicated in how it executes, you know. So when you put certain types of buildings on the board, they come onto the board with resources, and then those resources become shared resources for the other players. And a simple rule set leads to this emergent marketplace that really impacts every turn and every decision that you make. And in our play, it got to the end, and no one wanted to put those buildings out on the board anymore because they weren't going to pay off. Because in order for those buildings to pay off, they must have all their resources used. And so that drove up prices on sort of the foreign market, and it squeezed the back end of the game in the absolute perfect way. And so I was just left so impressed with how that all functioned together in a way that had low rules overhead, but we were wheeling and dealing, not wheeling and dealing in a negotiation way, but we were sort of cajoling each other and saying, no, don't you think about putting out any more of that type of building. I'm doing that. You know, I'm the cotton man. And just really a very good first play for me of Brass Lancashire. And in some ways, I shouldn't be surprised, given that these are two of the highest rated games on Board Game Geek ever. Brass Birmingham being the newest version, that being at rank 3. Brass Lancashire being the 17th best board game of all time. Really, really enjoyed the first play of Brass. I know, Neelan, this was your first time playing Lancashire versus Birmingham. What was your take on sort of the differences between those two?
What's funny about that actually is that I had sort of had it in my head that Birmingham was a more streamlined version of Lancashire, and I actually don't think that's true in retrospect. If anything, Lancashire has less rules overhead, but it's a more punishing game. And I think what I was trying to figure that out over the course of playing about what specifically was about it that changed it, because there's not that much actually different between them at all mechanically, but the board in Lancashire is designed in a way to be a bit more restrictive, in a way that you have to be setting yourself up well for future turns. Like, one of the things that's crucial in both games is that there's this two halves of the game, and if you don't have infrastructure going into the second half, you're going to be in a bad position to like build out your network. And that becomes so much more punishing in my experience in Lancashire, because the position of industries on the board is everything. I think the people at Roxley did a good job of taking Lancashire, which is an incredible solid game. And I almost struggle to find which of the two I prefer, to be quite honest. But I think what Roxley did very smartly is taking that design and kind of shaving off edges in terms of where you would feel inordinately punished by the game systems. And like, some people will prefer that. Some people prefer the game that you sort of have to play several times to learn those tricks yourself. But Birmingham sort of unifies everything a little bit more. Like, you can't build yourself into a corner as easily. It's a little bit friendlier across the board, and it does that by adding some rules into the system, like beer and so on. Really incredible game. I love Brass Birmingham, and Brass Lancashire definitely held up, and I definitely see why it's been held in such regard for as long as it has. I will say that every time I look at the original version of Brass, like, aesthetically, I'm glad I held out until the Roxley new production, but it's phenomenal. It's phenomenal.
Yeah, this was my first time playing it after a little while, and, you know, it just blew me away yet again. I just absolutely love the game. I love how you have to sort of see what your opponents are giving you and how the board is progressing and take advantage when you can. You know, you may not have had a strategy to be a person who supplies the iron or supplies the coal, but if that coal market is lacking and you can jump in there, you jump in there. You know, there's a lot of times where I had an idea where I wanted to go, and then things changed on the board, or I saw opportunity and I thought I had to jump at it. It's just great. You know, we played a game where, as Kellen said, the resources were real thin at the end, and everything was costing a lot because you had to get your resources from the outside market, which is quite expensive when they're all been tapped. I've definitely played games where that was not the case at all, and things were still cheap to build at the end. And I just love how different games of Brass can turn out in different ways. So another genre of games that Wallace is really known for is his train game designs. I think along with 18XX and the Winsome games, the third rail, if you allow me, of train games is the Age of Steam games that Wallace invented. That led way to Railroad Tycoon, which is a version of the Age of Steam model, and Railroad Tycoon was reimagined sort of as Railways of the World, which is another game we played. One of the reasons that I picked up Railways is I know it is a darling of the Pigeon Blood Tank, Dan Hughes, of Sporadically Bored. He's a huge fan of it, and I had it for a long time, and we finally got to crack it open at our little mini Wallace Con. What did you guys think of Railways of the World? What sort of Wallace-isms did you sort of pick out of it?
I liked it a lot, and like, the thing I wasn't expecting is something I alluded to a little bit earlier, was having not played a lot of these train games. One of the core components of Railways of the World is this idea that you can't necessarily build a line everywhere, so at some point I have to use other people's lines in order to get points. So if I have a long line and then Kellen's got the last leg of that track connecting a city, I might be like, okay, I will ship this good, I'll get 4 points and Kellen will get a point because I'm using one of his links, you know? And those sorts of decisions and trade-offs are the core part of it. When is it appropriate to use someone else's infrastructure to get a benefit, especially if that benefit is very precisely timed, because if I don't do it now, then Mark is going to get 5 points off of that cube, you know? Like, those evaluations of when to use the infrastructure and when not to, and when to just sort of like build somewhere completely separately on your own, like, those remind me very much of what I love about Brass. So it was a pretty good introduction to the world of train games through almost like a system that I knew I appreciated already. And like, it's a lot simpler conceptually than Brass. It's lay track, pick up cube, deliver cube, with some cool card powers along the way. But yeah, I thought it was a cool system. I did think that the cards felt a little bit swingy. So one of the things that happens is every round a new card comes up, and there are times where you look at a card and you look at who's going to be able to benefit mostly from it, and it's one player and they're going to get like 5 points from it and no one else will get anything from it. And that sucks. Like, you never want to see that happen where like a single card is hugely beneficial to one player alone. And that happened more frequently than I would have liked. But I also wouldn't get rid of the cards entirely, because that focus when you get to the beginning of a round of evaluating the turn order is crucial. Like, oh man, this card seems good. I want to make sure I get in on that, like this round.
And this is a good point to bring up Wallace's sort of iterating on his own designs, because there are a lot of things that are similar between Railways of the World and Age of Steam, but one way they're different is the addition of these cards. And another way they're different is that Railways of the World is a little more streamlined, but it also introduces these cards that make for a swingier / you could call it sort of more exciting experience where you don't, a lot of your strategy is going to be based on the next card that comes out. Like if a card comes out that allows you to lay track on water inexpensively, you may want to try to be the first player to grab that card. It may be very, very vital to you. Age of Steam does without all that stuff. Instead, you're bidding for a lot of that stuff. So I enjoyed our play of Railways of the World for how streamlined it was, while also introducing like a generally heavy type of game, the train game, the Age of Steam game. But one of the things that, as Nealon was saying, that I did sort of not love was the card play and the card swinginess. And it did make me want to crack open Age of Steam again and play the quote unquote purer version of it. Although I do see a lot of the pluses to Railways of the World.
How much heavier are we talking making that jump to Age of Steam? Because now I'm curious to see.
Not heavy, not much.
Okay, great. Then I think that sounds like something I should try then.
I want to diverge. No, I want to disagree. I always want to disagree with you two. I think that the caveat is that I am not a train game player, and so the lineage of who recreated who and who came up with what mechanism first and how it's been re-implemented here is entirely lost on me, because I wasn't even born when this started. But I found Railways of the World probably the worst train game I've ever played. And what we're talking about is Age of Steam, Mini Express, Iberian Gauge, Chicago Express, Irish Gauge, all games that feel pretty similar to Railways of the World and probably are inspired by Railways of the World, to be completely clear, but don't have the entirely swingy cards. I didn't hate it by any stretch of the imagination, and I have not played the hardcore actual 18xx games. Actually, there is another Martin Wallace game, interestingly enough, called Via Nebula, which is like a train game in disguise, or a non-train game that's actually a train game. I don't know if either of you have ever played Via Nebula, but it was him taking a lot of these systems and then putting really, really cutesy art on it, where instead of building railways, you're like getting rid of clouds. But it's the same sort of resources on shared stuff, and you're trying to move it that way, and they're trying to move it this way with a small subset of actions.
And Via Nebula is sort of a combination of some of the principles from Age of Steam / Railways of the World with some of the ideas from Brass. He's talked about how that's where the design came from. He's trying to simplify both games and sort of combine them.
Yeah. So we played the Mexico map of Railways of the World. I liked it. I do want to laud him for putting ridiculous cards into the game. And that is another throughput that we'll probably get to. I like having fun card powers in games, and a lot of the games that come out in 2020, they are pretending like there are cool combos on the cards, and then the action abilities of the cards is like +1 this way or -1 that way. And no, when a new card comes out in Railways of the World, it's like there is audible, what? Like I want that card, or I want that card, and it's immediately apparent that it's a powerful ability, and that is pure fun. It can get a little weird in the last round, the second to last round of the game, where you may just have to like spend all your money to prevent Mark from buying a card that otherwise would score him enough points to win the game, and that feels weird.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely agree. So in addition to these two sort of fundamental / influential game designs, you have Brass, which is a relatively heavy economic game, and you've got Age of Steam / Railways of the World, which is, again, influential in the train game avenue of board games. He also doesn't shy away from quicker games. Both of those games, for as much meat as there is on those bones, I think they're both under 2 hours in general. You can get away with playing both of them in under 2 hours. He has a lot of games that are much quicker. One is one that we talked about recently, Wildlands, which is a excellent skirmish game from a couple of years ago, where you are running around sort of like trying to grab gems that your opponents have placed for you on the board, and the fights are quick. And when you're presented with this game, it looks like there's a lot going on, but you play it very quickly and it's done in 45 minutes. And he's got a number of games like that where they're like fighty and quick and fast.
And just to put a point on this, in 2018 alone, Mr. Martin Wallace released Wildlands, Australia, Lincoln, Railways of Nippon, Brass Birmingham, and MOA. So 6 games from Mr. Wallace himself in 1 year of 2018. It's pretty prolific.
Yeah. And that has a lot to do with his change in design style. Back in the early 2000s, he had his own production company, which was called War Frog, which became Tree Frog. And the idea there was he was publishing the games themselves, often like with his family and friends, just like boxing the games together. And the idea was like the rule set was really simple and all the pieces were wood. That's the tree part of it. With no cards, there were no paper, it was all wooden pieces and a rule set.
Tree Frog as in we kill trees to make these games, frog?
Right.
Got
exactly.
it.
That's exactly right. But since I think 2017 was the last game that Tree Frog did, which was Handful of Stars, which is a game that I've got, which is a Grail game that I have not played yet, but I'm eager to play. But that was the end of Tree Frog, and now he's become sort of like a designer for hire where companies will approach him. So I think that allows him to be more prolific and not worry about the publishing part of things.
Yeah, and I think if you're the kind of person who wants to explore one designer's games and sort of see how they influence other games, Wallace would be a fascinating one. Like I even went down a rabbit hole after we played Brass Lancashire to see that he tried to iterate on Brass himself, right, and made a game called Age of Industry, which was him trying to simplify Brass already. And so, like, having loved that, I'd love to try Age of Industry, even though it wasn't as well received as these new versions of Brass, just because it's Wallace going, okay, what can I do with that thing that people love? How do I twist it again? And like, that's fun. There's that like, I'm exploring Wikipedia, but it's only Martin Wallace games and how they're all connected to each other.
Yeah, I think what he said about Age of Industry was you can now play something with a depth of Brass, but in half the time. I've played Age of Industry. I like it, but I think I compared it to Brass in the play and I think it fell short, but it is a quicker game. And yeah, just again, another reoccurring theme in the Wallace design oeuvre. And finally, the last game that we played in Wallace-a-thon yesterday was Nanty Narking, which is a reimagining of, Callan, give us the title.
Morkaporfa?
Yep, that's perfect. Every time, Callan.
Discworld, Morkaporf.
Yeah. Which is a game, I think, closer to the Wildlands system. For those who don't know, Nanty Narking, again, a reimagining of the Discworld game, is a game where everybody is dealt a character and they have secret win conditions. And from there, you've got a hand of cards and you're just playing cards really, really quickly. There are 5 or 6 actions that cards can do, and you're just playing cards one after another. Really, really quick moving game. Placing your characters, placing buildings on the board. It moves very fast, and the entire time you're just trying to suss out which character is which. Is Nealon Fagin? Is he trying to...
Nealon was, in fact, Mr. Fagin.
I was not.
He was not Fagin. Yeah, I accused him very strenuously of being Fagin and trying to spread trouble across London town, but in the end, he was not Fagin. But we got that game done, I think, in about 45 minutes. But again, just really exciting. In a lot of ways, a counter to Brass and to Railways of the World. This is like a very fast, screamy, card, play sort of thing.
Yeah, so this was one that I was very excited to have you guys try. I know Nealon had played Morkaporfa on a previous life, and I had played Nanty Narking with my family and had a great time. It takes from Archipelago, sort of one of my favorite systems of having a completely hidden win objective, and so the entire game is just sussing out what your friends are doing, and the actual mechanisms are pretty paper thin. I was just struck again by how ridiculous the cards were and how fun, just straight fun it was. You have a 5-card hand limit, so at the end of your turn, if you have 2 cards left, you get to draw 3 cards, right? And one of the cards that I have is just like, select a player, either they give you 5 coins, or this is one of their 5 cards for the rest of their game. Their hand limit is permanently reduced. And the love or the light leaving Nealon's eyes, as I showed him the card, and there was just this like, what? Like, how is this a card in a modern board game that works? And it was hilarious. I was so happy at his deflation.
Yeah, I mean, if any game delivers on like that high you were talking about of like, wait, what does that card do? Like, I mean, this was it. That's what this game is in a nutshell. Like, it's exceedingly silly because you play a card and then you watch people eyes glaze over like what your card does. But that's the fun of it. It's like picking up a card and be like, oh, I can't wait to use this on my next turn. And then you wrap that in like the hidden identity, like I'm going to pretend to be one thing, but secretly I'm trying to do something else. And I think there's a lot about this game that I should like on paper. Like, I think it's a little bit telling that even in the Discworld themed version of this, which is a property I love, and if anything, like Martin Wallace having made not one, but 2 Discworld games cements him as someone I care about intimately. But, but I kind of found it a little bit too... Like, it was fun for a couple of games, and I was very excited to re-explore it in Nanty Narking, but it does have a little bit of that wild unpredictability to it, and that's the fun, and that's what you'd want to go into it for. But like, as like take thatty experiences go, this is like at the top level of that.
Right, and if this game was double the length,
of course,
if this was an hour and a half game, it would be way, way worse. But it's just, I think it feels to me just the right amount of time.
Our game ended, unfortunately, and I think I am probably not known on the podcast for any sort of generosity, but like I had amassed a bunch of money, and money was not my win condition, and then I got a card that let me swappy my win condition randomly, and out of the 4 cards that I drew the money card, and I was a little bit frustrated because I knew I was kind of set up in a position just sort of like end with a win and a whimper, and I would have loved for one of you two to have done that, as opposed to me kind of just going like, well, I win, because you have to reveal your win at the start of your turn versus the end. This strikes me as the perfect game for like a less experienced group of gamers, and they're going to play it 50 times and like have a meta of like, well, why is he spreading trouble, and like really feinting and bluffing. And I think one of the things it does so well is that you can actually spend turns bluffing. A lot of these modern games pretend like they have that element, but if you spend any amount of time actually doing that thing, you would lose the game because you wouldn't have enough actions to get to your actual victory condition. And funnily enough, it reminded me of my favorite Martin Wallace game, which is A Study in Emerald, the 2nd edition. And we will, at the end, probably get to a segment that Mark doesn't know, which is what is the Martin Wallace game that you must play next? And for me, the answer to that question is A Study in Emerald 1st edition. So before the 1st edition stands at me, I will say that. But the 2nd edition of A Study in Emerald is just a delightfully weird deck builder, area control hybrid with 2 separate teams. I've talked about it in my top 50 games of all time every year. He is not afraid to do weird things. It's a weird hand management game with icons where you're sort of collecting icons across different cards, trying to figure out who's doing what and why. It's delightfully weird. It's all over in 90 minutes or less. And you just combine a lot of things together that you wouldn't expect. And I certainly would not expect A Study in Emerald 2nd edition to come from the man that brought us Age of Steam and Brass Lancashire. And so just a delightful gameography for him, sort of going in so many different directions.
So, Neelan, why don't you give us your final thoughts on maybe your thoughts on Wallace, maybe games you're looking forward to, your general thoughts on the man himself.
Yeah, I think I will circle back around to something I said at the beginning. I want to try so many of the games he has on offer. Like, one of the games we didn't even touch on at all this episode was another one that we'd played a couple of years back called Australia, which is this bizarre mix of a competitive game where you're simultaneously trying to defend a countryside that's being encroached on by, I believe they're zombies.
It's Cthulhu.
It's a Cthulhu himself, but there it is. And that like is such a cool structure. Like as soon as Mark says like he designs for theme first, I can just imagine this idea coming to him of like, there's this encroaching threat and you're all trying to defend against it while competing with it. And that's cool. That game did not hit, I think, for any of the people that played it. But It was so novel and it was just so weird. And that's what I love about him. I would say that of the stuff of his that I would be interested in playing next is one that Kellen has been talking about, something in his collection called Hit Z Road, which I don't have any familiarity with. But the way Kellen has described it sounds like something I just want to try. I believe it's quite well loved as well.
Yeah, kind of like a gem. It's on the lighter end of his stuff, but there's definitely enough people who liked it that I'm like, I'm going to pick that up in a sale and hold on to it until we get to it 5 years from now.
And I'm also itching to return to A Study in Emerald. I played one game of it with Kellen a few years ago and thought it was really, really interesting. Again, in that like hidden identity, like not trying to reveal too much about what your objectives are realm. I would love to play that again.
As for me, our Wallace Con just reignited my excitement to play his games. Again, our play of Brass was just fantastic for me. But I've got a number of his games I've yet to crack open. I think first and foremost of the ones that I own of his is Handful of Stars, which again is a hard to find one that I'm interested in playing, as well as Tinner's Trail. That's another one that I've got. I think it was one of the first Tree Frog games, and I think he numbered all his copies, and I think I have number 13 of all the Tinner's Trails out there. I know it's being redone by, I think, Capstone or somebody, but that's another one I'm eager to play, as well as his latest design, which I don't think has been released yet, at least not in the US, Anno 1800, which is a take on a computer game, but I've heard really, really good things about that, and also that it's very interesting. I think it's sort of like has a deck building mechanism to it where the win condition is to get rid of all your cards, but while having like a Euro economic slant to it. Just heard very interesting things about it, so I'm very, very excited to get my hands on that as well.
I'm interested to see what he does with that, because I have a lot of familiarity with the video game, and as far as I can tell, it's not necessarily like, it's not a one-to-one recreation of like the game in any sort of form, but like I've spoken before about how I like to see things I like translated into different mediums, like adaptations of things, and like that's one where, you know, I've played a lot of the Anno games, and like how he has chosen to translate that is interesting to me. It kind of made me all the more sad that given his history at Games Workshop, he has yet to do a Warhammer take on anything, because I'm just like so curious what a Martin Wallace Warhammer themed game looks like.
I know I already did mine with the first edition of A Study in Emerald, but that I believe is very expensive to get a hold of. So if you have a lead on how to get a copy of the first edition, feel free to email me at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com. But another one of his older games that I remember buying when I first got into the hobby, and I have already sold it, but in the preparation for this episode, I looked at the cover and said, oh yeah, I really want that one, is a game of his from 1998 called Liberté. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, but it's a game about the French Revolution where there are 3 different factions that you are not controlling directly, but you are influencing them in sort of an area control fighty way. And I remember always being intrigued by what I had heard about that and would love to give that a go. I do think that one of the best moments of our Wallace Con weekend was when Mark started to explain why something worked thematically, and I stopped him mid-sentence because I didn't want to know, because it would not help me with the game. And I think Wallace does do some historical stuff that's cool if you're into that, but I am not into that. So my interest in Liberté is purely mechanical and has nothing to do with the French Revolution, which I think the French Revolution is the setting of Les Miserables, right? So it gave us that.
France, yeah.
And I think to expound on what Callan mentioned, his sort of little anecdote, I think I was trying to explain why coal was more difficult to acquire than tin, and why you had to sort of like build the infrastructure. And as soon as I started into it, he's like, I don't care.
I was being genuine and not trying
you
to
were,
be.
You were. You apologized even though you didn't need to, because I know it was in jest, but it was hilarious. It was, I think, one of the highlights of the Wallace Con 2021. So that's going to do it for our review of the man, the myth, the Martin Wallace. And that's going to do it for our episode. Thank you all so much for listening. To reach us, we're on all forms of social media. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. You can email us at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com. You can vote for last week's winner, in your opinion, at boardgamebarrage.com/draft to try to win yourself $50. By the time this episode goes up, you could go to our wiki at boardgamebarrage.com/wiki and not only see the Wallace game we mentioned in this episode, but in all the Wallace games that we've mentioned on previous episodes. I know we've talked about a number in the past, so if you're interested in seeing our thoughts on other Wallace games, go to boardgamebarrage.com/wiki. Thank you as always to Heart Society for our intro and outro song, What's on Your Mind, Kid? And until next week, bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh wait, Michael Crichton died in 2000.
Yeah, I don't think he's seen Jurassic World.
Do you ever just have the name of the episode in your head, and then I've been spending like the last hour trying to justify it? Okay.
No, but I can't wait.
Okay. The episode is called "Catch a Falling Wallace."
I do not get it at all.
Neither do I.
Catch a falling Wallace?
Done.
Okay.